Hello, I'm Ed Gordon. Whichever man wins the 2020 election, he will face a fragile economic situation. An uncertain ending to the pandemic has made the economy unstable, and systematic racism keeps Black Americans vulnerable. Who has the best plan for shoring up the economy? And will Blacks get a bigger slice of the economic pie after November 3rd? Today, a look at money and your vote. Up next on Impact the Vote. The pandemic has put employment and the economy in a precarious position. As always, many African Americans find themselves with less wherewithal to weather the storm. For decades, politicians have promised more financial and employment opportunities for Blacks. However, the old adage, last hired, first fired, still remains true. Little has been done to close the growing wealth gap between Blacks and whites in America, and the immediate future leaves little room for financial security for most. Will it matter which party holds power? And can your vote make money grow and your job more secure? Joining me now is John Rogers, Chairman and co-CEO of Ariel Investments, the largest minority-run mutual fund in the nation. John, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Let me ask you, what do you see right now with such an uncertain future with the pandemic? How would you advise whoever sits in the White House, whoever sits in the Oval Office, to walk carefully?
If whoever gets into the Oval Office, and hopefully it's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is our vice president, hopefully they will understand that it's important to fight for economic justice as well as social justice. That we have to have a stronger Black business community in this country that can provide jobs for ourselves, provide philanthropy for our communities, provide role models for next generation leaders. And we've gotten away from that in this country. So we need political leadership to focus on empowering and strengthening Black businesses and Black business leaders here in this nation.
John, you and I have known each other for many years now. We've done many a panel together. But much of what I've heard over the last 2 or 3 decades has been the same promises to African-American people of color, the underserved. What should be done? What can be done to make a difference this time?
Well, I think we need to go back in history. And, you and I are of the similar age, and we remember the extraordinary leadership of our pioneering Black mayors, Coleman Young in Detroit, Marion Barry in D.C., and of course my hero, Maynard Jackson in Atlanta. And they were always there battling and fighting to make sure that not only were their cities going to do business with Black businesses, but they insisted that the anchor institutions in the local communities, the museums, the hospitals, the corporations, worked with Black businesses too. And we need to get back to that kind of leadership. We have some of it now in the House, where you have a Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, people like that are making a profound impact and opening up doors and forcing doors open for all of us. But we need to use our vote to get sure that we have more and more progressive leaders in place.
John, here's what's interesting. Citigroup just released findings of a study that said over the last 20 years, 16 trillion, that's with a T, dollars have been lost by the U.S. economy by virtue of racism. It doesn't seem that a country that loves the bottom line understands that racism really drags it down to the mud. Do you have any hope that with this new quote unquote reckoning in America, we're going to see a difference?
I'm getting somewhat hopeful. Not only are we seeing more and more progressive leaders in Congress that I touched on earlier, but you're also starting to see white CEOs are reaching out for the first time in my 37 years at Ariel, where people are calling, wanting to talk about these issues, wanting to see, do we have ideas of who can be on their board? Do we have ideas of who can be in their executive ranks? Helping them think through policies to embrace diversity and inclusion. And literally, I'm having a call like that every day or so. Melody Hobson, my co-CEO, is getting many calls a day asking for that kind of support. It feels like these big giant companies are really understanding that they've got to try to do the right things. Some are doing it kicking and screaming, but they just realize that the momentum is moving so rapidly that they have to be able to get on the right side of economic justice.
John, one of the pushes that I have been putting forth for our community, whether it be politically, socially, and in this case, economically, is I believe we need some new narratives. Some of the old ways of doing have not always worked and certainly are a bit archaic in my mind in some ways. What would you suggest economically for our community may be a new narrative we should look at?
Thanks for asking. A couple things I'm trying to do on the corporate boards that I'm engaged in, and then also talking with the companies we've invested in at Ariel Investments, is that we need to change the terminology in a couple of areas. One, the term supplier diversity needs to be retired. The University of Chicago started using the term business diversity about 10 years ago. And the idea there is to signal to the employees at the university that African Americans should have a chance to do business in everything that the university buys, whether it's financial services, professional services, media, advertising, public relations, everything, instead of this idea of supply chain only. And I've been saying it publicly, it's kind of like a modern day Jim Crow. The black and brown people get to do the catering and the construction, which is important. The white men get to do the things where the real wealth's being created. The guys running the hedge funds, the venture capital firms, the private equity firms, the big consulting firms, big insurance companies. That's where the real wealth and power is today. So we got to get rid of the term supplier diversity and turn it into business diversity. But you also need access to customers. And we've got to get these anchor institutions to get into the habit when they're going out and buying services. They've got to use African-American businesses in everything that they do. So if we can get rid of that idea of just access to capital, but say access to customers at the same time, I think we can move our people forward and really start to put a dent in that wealth gap that you talked about earlier.
John, where do you sit with reparations?
I think right now, politically, it would be impossible to get anything through. And so I've been saying we should spend our energy getting these anchor institutions to do their reparations by doing business with us and hiring us in senior leadership roles. I always give the example that my great-grandfather had the Stratford Hotel that was burned down during the Tulsa race riots 99 years ago. I still look at Tulsa, and unfortunately, the big anchor institutions in Tulsa are still not doing business with black companies. And they have very few African-American executives in leadership roles. So they've got to at least, meet that threshold first and get that done, because that's something they could all do if they really wanted to see the wealth and opportunity gap transformed for African-Americans. Systematic racism still is pervasive in our country, and the unconscious or implicit bias that's out there is still there. And the way I always look at it, I always tell folks that the most important thing when you're trying to identify whether white Americans are treating blacks fairly is to ask them sort of three questions. One, who do they have in their C-suite of their companies, on their management committees, in their leadership roles? Who do they have on their board of directors? Who do they vacation with? Who do they socialize with? That's what you look for. So when you look at a Donald Trump, we know at the Trump organization, I don't know of any African Americans that were senior at the Trump organization. We know there's one black cabinet member, which is one of the lowest numbers in recent history. We know there are very few African Americans in senior roles in the White House. And when you go and look at his social calendar and you see where he vacations, how he spends his time, and again, what he did at the Trump organization, he's had no history of interacting in a meaningful way with African Americans in leadership roles. And so I would make sure that people see that versus Joe Biden, who has a long history of working with African Americans in leadership roles. And he will then giving us a signal with the way that he will put his government together, put his White House together, put the right people in the cabinet. He's just shown a history of inclusion, and I think it'll only grow once he becomes president.
John Rogers, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us today. Greatly appreciate it.
It's great to be here.
Joining me now, economist Julianne Malveaux. Julianne, always good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Ed.
Let me ask you this. I was just asking John Rogers about reparations, something that became a hot button issue during the primaries, particularly on the Democratic side. Where do you see that now? Do you see it realistically? Certainly not if Donald Trump wins re-election, but how realistic do you see it as a possibility if Biden and Harris win?
Well, Sheila Jackson Lee has pushed forward the legislation that the late Congressman John Conyers pushed for since 1989. It was initially introduced as a bill to study reparations, but now it's a bill to deal with action. And racism is baked into the cake that's called America. Post-enslavement, white people passed laws to prevent Black people from accumulating, from owning the tools of their trade, basically to, as folks have said, slavery by another name. And when we begin to look at that, we see what has been taken from our community, and we see why our community needs to be both monetarily and psychologically repaired. And I'm a member of the National African American Reparations Commission. I support our goals, but I also think that we should be somewhat more specific. Whatever Trump is saying, just throw it away, to the left, to the left. I mean, when someone says they're the best president since Lincoln, and we had Lyndon Johnson, who probably was the president who pushed our desires forward more than anyone else with the war on poverty and other things, I think it's delusional to think of anything that Mr. 45 says. But on the Democratic side, I don't think that Democrats have been as aggressive as they might be. I think there's a lot of people have a lot of questions about what do Black people want. We want fairness. We want equality. We want equity. We don't want to have a thumb on the scale. The thumb has been on the scale from 1877 until 1964.
Julianne, let me ask you about where we sit right now, and it doesn't matter which party gets in the House. This pandemic, the unknown of the pandemic, is quietly, and I say quietly because I don't think people are really looking at the economy for what it will be in 3 months, in 6 months, in a year from now. Give me a sense of a forecast, if you will, or whether or not you can even forecast because of the unknown here.
Well, you really can't forecast much, but here's what we know. Until you get control of the pandemic, you will not get control of the economy. And I see it at a micro level. I mean, I'm a girl who loves to eat out. In the last 6 months, I've eaten out 3 times. 3. And I know other sister friends, same thing. We're frightened. We're over 65. We're not trying to pick up any diseases or right. So the places that we go, we see places that are closed. We've lost 40% of our Black-owned businesses, Ed. 40% of them. So when we look at an economic forecast, the macro forecast is that we'll probably come roaring back in early 21. But what does that mean for Black-owned businesses and Black people?
When we talk about systematic racism, and we talk about Citigroup suggesting, again, $16 trillion lost over the last 20 years because of racism, give us a want to vote to make sure that these kinds of things are addressed.
We need to address public policy in a way that the thumb comes off the scale. I think that Biden is perfect, but I think that he's very good. And I think that he gets it, and his thumb will come off the scale. The thumb on the scale is what the sharecroppers' masters did in the post-Reconstruction period when folks went to weigh their product, and the thumb was on the scale, so people got cheated. The thumb has been on the scale in these United States for the past 90 years. We've had periods where it hasn't been, but there are periods that have been. I think Biden does that. Now, is he perfect? No. But here's the deal. When you talk about elections, you never get a perfect candidate. What you get is a compromise candidate. And we have to compromise. Let's compromise to a Biden and not to a Trump. It's more than saying Biden is not Trump. I mean, we do have to get rid of Trump. I mean, he's crazy. But what we have to say is, let's look at Biden's Lift Every Voice. Again, not perfect, but sitting there with a possibility of input. Let's look at Biden's choice of Kamala Harris. That speaks to his ability to reach across all kinds of racial lines, racial, gender, and Kamala's not perfect either. but we're never going to get perfect candidates in this country. What we're going to get is input. Voting is not the most you can do, it's the least you can do. Once you vote, then you have to commit to be engaged in the civic process of doing a town hall thing, doing the local elections. You can't just say I voted, because that's not good enough. What you have to say is, I'm committed to the process.
Indeed. I always say election day is day one, not the last day. Julianne Malveaux, as always, thank you so much for joining us. And as we were telling you during the break, beautiful art.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Julianne. When we return, does either man have an economic plan that will bring teeth to the Black community? And can you legislate systematic racism? Our panel joins us when we return. Time now to turn to our panel. Today we're joined by Paris Dennard, RNC Senior Advisor, Michelle Bernard, President and CEO, Bernard Center for Women, Politics, and Public Policy, and pollster Terrence Woodbury. He is a partner at Hit Strategies. Thank you all for joining us. Greatly appreciate it. Let's talk a little bit about, if we can, and Terrence, I'll start with you. Typically the lifeblood, if we go back, it's the economy, stupid. Is often the tipping point for an election that's close. Where do we sit right now by means of what you've been seeing?
Voters of color are being disproportionately impacted by the economic impacts that COVID-19 has had on our community, and Black voters in particular are expressing a considerable level of anxiety around the economy. In fact, the top three issues for Black voters in this election cycle are COVID-19, racism, and the economy. And what we've seen from Black voters, both in focus groups and in polling, is that they do expect that to be addressed explicitly, addressing Black economic conditions, and to explicitly to address how systemic racism has affected the economic conditions of Black voters.
Paris, let me take you to the Platinum Plan, which is Donald Trump's plan for the African-American community, his economic plan. And while some, I've heard African-Americans who've looked at it suggest that it is a decent enough plan, they're bothered by the idea that he and others in his administration suggest that systematic racism is a myth, a farce, and no longer exists. Paris, what would you say to that?
I would say that the president's Platinum Plan is one that is something that the Black community needs. When you talk about $500 billion worth of access to capital, when you have 3 million new jobs created for the Black community, which we're just proposing to do, and have 1,000 new Black businesses, making the Minority Business Development Agency permanently funded, these are things that are going to be positively impacting the Black community. The question becomes, why is it now systemic racism something that we think needs to be tackled when Joe Biden, because the campaigns between the two individuals, Joe Biden and President Donald J. Trump, has done nothing for systemic racism for 47 years while he was a senator and a vice president. And the question becomes, well, where was that call to make some systemic changes then, as a VP or as the number 2 to the first Black president?
So let me ask you this. Let's be clear, Paris. I think the African-American community or people in general would suggest that the cries for the ending of systemic racism didn't just happen when Donald Trump took office. That being said, there will be those who will liken it, if you will, to Breonna Taylor's payment to the family $12 million, yet no justice in the court system. They may say the Platinum Plan is great, but without the acknowledgement in a true sense of systemic racism, what good does that do?
I think $12 million sends a powerful message, and I think that the reforms that are coming with it, it sends a powerful message too. So I don't think that, I would hope that they wouldn't take the notion of what good does it do, because it does do does do something. It is a form of justice.
I
because I really just very respectfully have to completely disagree. I think that Trump's plan is pure rubbish. It's poppycock. You know, when he ran in 2016, he said to the African-American community, please vote for me. What do you have to lose? Well, we have learned time and time again during his administration, and not just during his administration, but prior to that, but particularly right now, we have learned as a community that the greatest thing that we have to lose is our lives. So the plan is great on paper, but the bottom line is Breonna Taylor's family would rather have her than $12 million. If you are not alive, the plan is of no consequence to you whatsoever.
So let me ask you this, Michelle, to follow up, and I don't mean to interrupt. You can continue your thought, but let me just throw this out as well. If we look at the Platinum Plan, if we look at Joe Biden's Lift Every Voice, if we look back at every administration from the time that I can remember following politics, everyone has had a plan for quote unquote Black America. And it was, as we know, that's, you know, a blanket monolith, if you will, that hasn't really moved the needle enough to suggest that these plans, save Lyndon Johnson, that have assisted in ending poverty, decreasing crime, better schools, et cetera. So should we hold this plan more accountable than any others, including Joe Biden's?
I don't think we need to hold it more accountable. I think that both Democrats and Republicans need to realize that there's no Democratic plan, at least as far as I'm concerned, and no Republican plan that is all of a sudden going to wipe out hundreds of years of systemic discrimination against Black and brown people. It's great that you've got a plan, but the plan means nothing if you don't enforce anti-discrimination laws. No plan means anything if you don't enforce wage discrimination laws, if you don't have an EEOC that has real teeth to it. And also, we've got to go even further and talk about things like how housing policy and discrimination in housing policy leads to people with unequal schools, which then again leads to the inability to go to a college and get a degree that is going to help you rise through the ranks and achieve America's promise.
I just have to push back on this idea that the Platinum Plan somehow solves the problems in the Black community. The biggest problem, all of the problems, the economic challenges that are facing the Black community, for the most part, are the consequence of systemic racism. And you simply cannot solve a problem if you are not willing to acknowledge it. You cannot solve a problem that you don't even acknowledge exists. Black voters don't want special rules. Black voters don't need special accommodations in order to succeed. What we need to do is fix the rules that have been stacked against us for years, and that begins with acknowledging that the problem is not with a person in a bank. The problem is within the systems that banking is operated. And so when you look at, we've conducted a lot of economic research for the Black Economic Alliance, which is a PAC that empowers Black voters economically. And when Black voters talk about their top economic agenda items, they include discrimination in a workplace. They include the inability to access capital and racist policies that make it harder to access capital. Those are systemic problems that require acknowledging how the system contributes to that.
I hope that your viewers don't take Terrence or Michelle's word for what the Platinum Plan says and actually read the Platinum Plan for themselves. We are free-thinking, independent Americans who can make up our own minds. The Platinum Plan is something that is worth noting. It is for a second-term agenda, just like Joe Biden's, his plan, Lift Every Voice, that he didn't even know the title of, is something that is for his term if he were to win. So I think the community should examine both plans, but give the president's plan a decent and fair look.
This is completely anecdotal, but when I speak to Black businessmen and women who own their own businesses that are doing well, they will all concede that the corporate tax cuts that went into effect under the Trump administration were fantastic for the bottom line of their businesses and for their own personal bottom line. So if you are someone that has the type of job that affords you a 401k plan, black or white, the Trump tax policies have been good for you. The question, though, is for the vast middle class and for people who are finding themselves to be perpetually a member of what we call the underclass, regardless of what administration is in place. You don't have a 401k plan. You are a minimum wage earner. The minimum wage has not increased, and it certainly is not going to increase under a Trump administration. You don't have a 401k plan, so whether his plan was good for stocks or not, it's of no consequence to you. And for those African Americans, quite frankly, for all African Americans, even those who own businesses and have 401k plans and own their own homes, what they will tell you is, regardless of the fact that the economy might have been good for their businesses, Donald Trump's stance on issues of personal liberty and civil rights are so atrocious that a vote for Donald Trump would be a vote against their own self-interest. And I think that after, for example, looking at the first presidential debate and listening to Trump say, for example, that he got rid of racial sensitivity training in the federal government because it basically discriminated against whites.
Yeah.
I think many Americans will say this president is not for me.
Black voters in particular, they put a premium on fairness and justice and equity, and that just rings as unfair. For a billionaire to pay less in taxes than a fast food worker, it rings as injustice. It rings as unfair. It reminds them of everything that is wrong with a system that has been oppressive to them. And I do think that Donald Trump was making inroads with Black voters, mostly because of his ability to market himself. Michelle Obama once said that Barack Obama failed from not having a marketing budget. Well, Donald Trump is a master marketer. And he has found a way to market himself and the small advances that he was able to make within the Black community. But I do think that voters that listen to what he had that are hearing what he has done with his taxes, that hear how he responded to issues of race and injustice in the first debate, I think that they're gonna reckon with the support that they consider giving him.
All right, Paris, Michelle, Terrence, thank you so much for joining us. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's be clear. Economic inequity for African Americans did not start with Donald Trump, nor has it occurred only under Republican administrations. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have economic plans for the, quote, Black community. However, it's fair to say neither will be transformative enough to overcome hundreds of years of being shut out of wealth building. Will Black voters use their political leverage to literally be paid back for their vote? The actions post-election day will show if all the talk of an economic reckoning in this country is more than just empty promises. That correction won't come on its own, and it will be more than likely taken seriously if political payback is due. Join us next week when we take a look at policing in America and the value of Black lives. I'm Ed Gordon. Thanks for joining us.